James took a deep breath as he stood outside the glass doors of Morgan Design Studio. His hands smoothed down his navy blue tie one last time. This job interview could change everything for him. At 28, he had bounced between smaller design firms, never finding the right fit or the chance to truly prove himself. The office was smaller than he expected, but tastefully designed with clean lines and warm lighting. A woman at the front desk smiled and directed him to a waiting area. James looked at the framed magazine covers and design awards lining the walls. The work was impressive, bold yet elegant. "Mr. Bennett, Elizabeth will see you now." James followed the assistant down a short hallway to a corner office with large windows. The woman who stood to greet him wasn't what he had pictured. Elizabeth Morgan was tall with silver gray hair cut in a stylish bob. She wore a simple black dress with a colorful scarf. Her handshake was firm, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Your portfolio caught my attention, Mr. Bennett," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "Particularly your work for that small coffee company. It showed real understanding of their needs." James relaxed slightly. "Thank you. I enjoyed that project. They wanted something that felt both modern and warm." For the next 30 minutes, Elizabeth asked direct questions about his design process, his influences, and his career goals. She didn't smile much, but she listened intently to his answers, occasionally making notes. James found himself wanting to impress her more than he had expected. "I'll be honest," Elizabeth said finally. "We need fresh thinking here. I've been in this business for almost 40 years, and I've seen many trends come and go. What I value is someone who can see beyond the current fashion." 3 days later, James got the call offering him the job. His starting salary was better than he had hoped for, and the opportunity to work at one of the most respected boutique design firms in the city felt like a dream. His first week was overwhelming. The pace was faster than his previous jobs, and Elizabeth's standards were even higher than he had anticipated. She rejected his first 2 design concepts for a new client with just a few words. Predictable. Think deeper. James stayed late on Friday, reworking his ideas. The office had emptied out, and he thought he was alone until he heard classical music playing softly from Elizabeth's office. He walked past her open door and saw her studying something on her computer screen, a small frown of concentration on her face. "Still here?" she asked without looking up. "Just working on those revisions," James replied. Elizabeth nodded. "Show me what you have." James hesitated, then brought his laptop to her desk. As he explained his new concept, Elizabeth listened without interruption. Her face gave nothing away until he finished. "Better," she said finally. "You're thinking about who they really are, not just what they asked for." "That's good." She pointed to one element. "But this needs to be stronger, more confident." As they worked together, James noticed small things about her: the elegant way she moved her hands when explaining a concept, how she tilted her head slightly when considering an idea, the subtle scent of her perfume that wasn't flowery but something more complex and interesting. "Why graphic design?" Elizabeth asked suddenly. The question surprised him. "I like creating something that connects with people. When design works right, it speaks without words." Something in her expression shifted. For just a moment, her professional mask slipped, and James caught a glimpse of warmth in her eyes. "That's a good answer," she said softly. "Very good." Walking home that evening, James felt a strange mix of exhaustion and energy. He had survived his first week, but more than that, he had earned a small moment of approval from Elizabeth Morgan. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. Yet all weekend, as he explored his new neighborhood, he found himself thinking about those brief moments in her office and looking forward to Monday in a way he hadn't expected. The weeks turned into months at Morgan Design Studio, and James found his place within the small team. His work improved under Elizabeth's careful guidance. She was demanding but fair, pushing him to refine his ideas until they shone. The other designers respected her but kept their distance. James noticed how they spoke about her when she wasn't around, with admiration but also a touch of fear. "Elizabeth rejected my entire campaign concept yesterday," complained Tom, one of the senior designers, during lunch. 3 weeks of work down the drain. "She knows what she's doing," James said, surprising himself by defending her. "Her instincts about clients are usually right." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Careful there, James. Don't become the teacher's pet." But James couldn't help feeling drawn to Elizabeth's creative vision. She had built this company from nothing in a time when women rarely led design firms. Her work from decades past still looked fresh and bold. One Tuesday afternoon, Elizabeth called James into her office. "We just landed the Riverside Hotel account," she said, a rare smile lighting up her face. "It's a complete rebranding. Logo, website, print materials, everything. I want you to work with me on this." James tried to hide his surprise. Elizabeth usually partnered with Tom or Anna on the biggest clients. "Really? I'd love to. Your ideas for the coffee shop campaign showed you understand how to blend tradition with modern appeal. That's exactly what Riverside needs." They began meeting daily to develop concepts. Sometimes they worked late into the evening, ordering dinner to the office. Elizabeth gradually relaxed around him. She told stories about the early days of her career, the challenges she faced as a woman in the industry, and her travels around the world seeking inspiration. "Paris in the rain is when I get my best ideas," she said one night, stretching in her chair. "Something about the light on the wet streets." James watched her hands as she sketched quick ideas on paper. Her fingers were slender, with a simple silver ring on her right hand. No wedding band. He had wondered about her personal life, but never dared to ask. "Have you traveled much, James?" she asked. "Not really. A few trips to Chicago and Boston for work. Nothing exciting." Elizabeth looked thoughtful. That should change. A designer needs to see how the world looks through different eyes. As they developed the hotel campaign, James began to notice a shift in how Elizabeth spoke to him. She asked for his opinion more often, really listening to his answers. When he made suggestions she liked, her face would light up in a way that made him feel 10 feet tall. One evening, they were the only ones left in the office. Rain pattered against the windows as they finalized presentation boards for the client meeting the next day. "I think we've done it," Elizabeth said, standing back to look at their work. "This is special." James nodded, feeling the satisfied exhaustion that came with good work. "It's the best thing I've ever been part of." Elizabeth smiled at him, and something in her expression made his heart beat faster. "You have real talent, James. I knew it from your portfolio, but seeing how you think, how you solve problems, it's impressive." Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. James felt a strange tension in the air between them. Elizabeth broke the silence first. "It's late, we should go." They packed up in comfortable quiet. When they reached the building entrance, they discovered the rain had become a downpour. Elizabeth frowned at the dark street. "My car's in the shop. I was planning to walk to the subway." "I have an umbrella," James offered. "I could walk you." Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." Under the umbrella, they walked close together through the rainy streets. James was acutely aware of her shoulder occasionally brushing against his, the scent of her perfume mixing with the fresh rain smell. "Where do you live?" he asked. "Garden Heights, the old brick building on Maple Street. That's a beautiful neighborhood. I've lived there 20 years. It's home." They reached the subway entrance too quickly. Elizabeth turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Thank you, James, for the umbrella and for your good work." She hesitated, as if wanting to say something more, then simply smiled and disappeared down the stairs. James stood there for a long moment, watching the spot where she had been, feeling strangely lost and found at the same time. The Riverside Hotel presentation was a success. The clients loved their ideas and signed the contract on the spot. Elizabeth took the team out for drinks to celebrate, something she rarely did. The small bar near their office had soft lighting and quiet jazz playing in the background. To the Riverside project, Elizabeth said, raising her glass of red wine. Everyone clinked glasses and congratulated each other. As the evening went on, the other team members left one by one until only James and Elizabeth remained at the corner table. She seemed more relaxed than he had ever seen her, her usual composed expression softened by the wine and the success of the day. "You know," she said, swirling the last of her wine, "in 40 years of design work, I still get nervous before big presentations." James smiled. "I would never have guessed. You seem so confident." "It's all an act," she laughed softly. "The secret is to look like you know what you're doing until you actually do." Something about the intimate setting and her openness made James bold. "Can I ask you something personal?" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow but nodded. Did you ever regret focusing so much on your career? I mean, instead of other things. She looked at him for a long moment. You're asking if I regret not having a family. James felt himself flush. I'm sorry, that's too personal. No, it's a fair question. Elizabeth set down her glass. I was married once, very young. It ended after 3 years. He wanted a traditional wife, and I wanted this. My own company, my own vision. She smiled a little sadly. There were other relationships after that, but none that seemed worth giving up my independence for. Do you regret it? James asked again softly. Some days, not often. She looked directly at him. What about you? Girlfriend. Boyfriend. Neither at the moment. I dated someone for 2 years in college, and there have been a few shorter relationships since. Nothing that felt right. Elizabeth nodded, then glanced at her watch. It's getting late. They walked out together into the cool night air. James felt a strange tension between them that hadn't been there before. I'll get a taxi, Elizabeth said. I could walk you home again. It's a nice night. She hesitated, then nodded. All right. They walked in comfortable silence for a while. The streets were quiet, and James felt hyper-aware of Elizabeth beside him. The rhythm of her steps, the occasional brush of her coat against his. You did very well today, she said finally. The way you explained the concept to the client, it was perfect. You have a gift for making people understand your vision. I learned that from you. She laughed. No, that's all you. Some things can't be taught. They reached her building too quickly. It was an elegant old brownstone with ornate details around the windows. Elizabeth stopped at the steps. Thank you for walking me home, she said. My pleasure. They stood facing each other. James felt his heart pounding in his chest. Before he could think about it, he leaned forward and kissed her cheek. It was a quick, light touch, but he felt Elizabeth freeze. James. I'm sorry, he said quickly, stepping back. I didn't mean to. It's all right, she said, her voice steady but her eyes troubled. But I think you should go home now. James nodded, embarrassment washing over him. Good night, Elizabeth. Good night. He walked away quickly, not looking back until he reached the corner. Elizabeth was still standing there, watching him go. She raised her hand in a small wave, then turned and went inside. James barely slept that night. He replayed the moment over and over, cursing himself for ruining their professional relationship. By morning, he had convinced himself he would be fired. But when he arrived at the office, Elizabeth greeted him normally. If anything, she was more formal than usual, speaking to him only about work matters. The easy rapport they had developed over the Riverside project was gone. The next week was tense. Elizabeth assigned him to work with Tom on a smaller project, and their interactions were limited to brief conversations in team meetings. James noticed her watching him sometimes with an unreadable expression, quickly looking away when he caught her eye. He missed their late evenings working together, the stories she shared, the way her eyes lit up when she loved one of his ideas. Most of all, he missed the glimpses of the woman behind the professional mask, a woman he had come to admire in ways that went far beyond respect for a boss or mentor. 2 weeks of awkward exchanges and careful distance had passed when Elizabeth called James into her office late one afternoon. She sat behind her desk, looking tired but composed. Close the door, please, she said. James did as she asked, his stomach tight with worry. This was it. She was going to fire him or at least give him a formal warning about professional boundaries. Sit down, James. He sat across from her, waiting for the blow to fall. Elizabeth took a deep breath. I think we need to talk about what happened. I'm sorry, James said immediately. It was completely inappropriate. It won't happen again. I know it won't, Elizabeth said, her voice carefully neutral. But I'm concerned that there might be feelings involved that could complicate our working relationship. James looked down at his hands. There was no point denying it anymore. Yes. There are. A heavy silence fell between them. When he finally looked up, Elizabeth was watching him with a complex expression, concern, confusion, and something else he couldn't quite read. I don't understand it, she said finally. I'm more than 30 years older than you, James. I know how old you are. Then why? James struggled to find the right words. It's not about age. It's about who you are, your mind, your talent, your strength, the way you see the world. He paused. I've never met anyone like you. Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her professional mask was back in place. I value you as a designer and as part of this team, but anything beyond that is impossible. You must see that. Because you're my boss? That's part of it, yes, but also because I'm 61 and you're 28. What could possibly come of that? What future could there be? The word future hung in the air between them. James hadn't thought that far ahead, had only known that being near her made him feel more alive than he had in years. I understand, he said finally. I'll request a transfer to another team, or if you prefer, I can look for another job. That's not necessary, Elizabeth said quickly, then seemed surprised by her own response. You're too valuable to the company. We can work through this professionally. James nodded, though his chest felt hollow. Is that all? Yes. Elizabeth hesitated, then added, no, actually, there's something else. She opened her desk drawer and took out a large envelope. The design conference in Chicago next month. I was planning to go, but I think you should take my place. James took the envelope, confused. Why? Because it would be good for your career, and because I think some distance might help clear the air. He understood then. She was trying to let him down gently, to give him space to get over his feelings for her. Thank you, he said, standing up. I appreciate the opportunity. At the door, he paused. Elizabeth. She looked up, her face carefully composed. I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable, but I'm not sorry for how I feel. James left for Chicago the following week. The conference was interesting, and he made some useful industry connections, but his thoughts kept returning to Elizabeth. On the third night, at a reception for conference speakers, he found himself standing beside an elegant woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Grace, a creative director from New York. First time at the conference, she asked. Yes. My boss was supposed to come, but she sent me instead. Grace smiled. Lucky you. Lucky me, James agreed without enthusiasm. Later, as they shared a taxi back to the hotel, Grace invited him for a nightcap. She was attractive and clearly interested in him, but all James could think about was Elizabeth, how she would have analyzed the speakers they'd heard, the sharp observations she would have made. I'm sorry, he said. I should get some rest. Grace smiled knowingly. Someone waiting for you back home? Not exactly. But someone you're waiting for? James nodded. Well, Grace said as the taxi stopped at their hotel, in my experience, things worth having are worth waiting for. But don't wait too long. Life is shorter than you think. Back in his room, James couldn't sleep. He thought about what Grace had said, about Elizabeth's face when she told him what he felt was impossible. On impulse, he took out his phone and sent Elizabeth a text. Chicago is interesting but would be better with your insights. The keynote speaker had some fascinating ideas about design and emotion that made me think of your work. He didn't expect a reply, not at midnight. But almost immediately his phone lit up with her response. Tell me about the keynote. James smiled and began to type. James returned from Chicago with a notebook full of ideas and a phone full of late-night text conversations with Elizabeth. They had kept their messages focused on design concepts and conference topics, but there was a warmth to their exchanges that hadn't been there before. A new kind of connection had formed in the distance between them. His first day back at the office, James found a small package on his desk. Inside was a book on French design movements with a simple note. Thought you might find this interesting after our discussions. E. He looked up and saw Elizabeth watching him from her office. She gave him a small smile before turning back to her computer. James held the book carefully, feeling the weight of the gesture. The next few weeks brought a careful return to their working relationship. Elizabeth assigned him to help with the ongoing Riverside Hotel project, and they fell back into their old rhythm of collaboration, but something had shifted. There were moments when their eyes would meet across the conference table, a shared understanding passing between them that no one else could see. One evening, as they worked late reviewing design proofs, Elizabeth sighed and took off her glasses, rubbing her eyes. Are you all right? James asked. Just tired. The board meeting tomorrow has me stressed. They want to discuss the future of the company. What about it? Elizabeth hesitated. I'm 61, James. They're starting to ask about succession planning. The words hit him hard. He hadn't thought about Elizabeth retiring, about a day when she wouldn't be there. What will you do? I don't know yet. She put her glasses back on. I'm not ready to leave, but I need to be realistic. The company wouldn't be the same without you. Elizabeth smiled sadly. No company should depend too much on one person. That's poor planning. They'd worked in silence for a while. James wanted to say more but couldn't find the right words. Finally, Elizabeth stood up. Let's call it a night. We've done enough. They walked out together. It was a warm spring evening, and the streets were busy with people enjoying the weather. Would you like to get some dinner? James asked suddenly. I'm starving, and there's that new Italian place around the corner. Elizabeth looked at him surprised. James, just dinner, he said quickly. As colleagues, I skipped lunch today. She hesitated, then nodded. All right, just dinner. The restaurant was small and dimly lit, with candles on each table. The hostess seated them in a quiet corner, mistaking them for a couple. Neither corrected her. Over pasta and wine, the conversation flowed easily, moving from work to books, films, and travel dreams. Elizabeth told him about her childhood in a small town, how she'd saved for years to move to the city and study design. What about you? She asked. What made you choose this path? My grandfather was an architect. He used to take me to construction sites when I was little, show me how ideas on paper became real places where people lived and worked. I wanted to create things too, just in a different way. Elizabeth smiled. He sounds wonderful. He was. He died when I was 15, but he'd be happy to see me now, I think. I'm sure he would be proud. As they walked back toward the subway, a light rain began to fall. James opened his umbrella, and they moved closer together beneath it, just as they had months ago. I've been thinking about what you said, Elizabeth said suddenly. About why you feel the way you do. James held his breath, waiting. I thought it was just a young man's fascination with someone different, someone older. But these conversations we've been having, she stopped walking and turned to face him. I find myself thinking about them all day, looking forward to your texts at night. Elizabeth. Let me finish, please. Her eyes met his, serious and clear. There's still everything standing in our way. The age difference, the company, what other people would think. And I'm not sure I have the courage to face all that, even if we wanted to try. What are you saying? She took a deep breath. I'm saying that I don't know what this is between us, but I can't pretend I don't feel it too. The rain fell around them, but James barely noticed. He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away, and touched her cheek. This time she didn't pull back. I don't have answers either, he said softly, but I think some things are worth figuring out as you go. Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, leaning slightly into his touch. When she opened them again, there was both fear and determination in her gaze. I need time, James, to think about what this means, what it could be. We have time, he said, though neither of them really knew if that was true. A week passed with meaningful glances and careful conversations. Elizabeth had asked for time, and James gave it to her, though each day of waiting felt longer than the last. They maintained their professional relationship at the office, but there was a new awareness between them that couldn't be ignored. On Friday afternoon, James was working at his desk when he received an email from Elizabeth. His heart jumped when he saw the subject line, "Dinner tonight." The message was simple, "My place, 8 p.m. If you're free, here's the address." James read the email 3 times to be sure he understood. He replied with a single word, "Yes." The rest of the day passed in a blur. James left work early, went home to change, and spent too long deciding what to wear. He finally settled on dark jeans and a blue button-down shirt that his last girlfriend had said matched his eyes. He stopped at a flower shop and bought a small arrangement of wildflowers, nothing too romantic, but not entirely casual either. Elizabeth's building was even more impressive up close than it had seemed that rainy night. A doorman nodded politely as James entered and directed him to the elevator. His hands felt clammy as he knocked on her door. Elizabeth opened it wearing a simple gray dress that fell just below her knees. Her silver hair was loose around her shoulders rather than in her usual work style. She looked younger somehow, more relaxed. "You came," she said, as if she had been uncertain. "Of course I did." James handed her the flowers. "These are for you." She smiled. "They're beautiful. Come in." Her apartment was exactly as James had imagined it, elegant but comfortable, with clean lines and thoughtful details. Art hung on the walls, not the trendy pieces that filled his friends' apartments but works with depth and history. Books filled the shelves, and large windows offered a view of the city lights. "This is lovely," he said. "I've lived here for 20 years, it's seen a lot of changes." Elizabeth gestured toward the dining area, where the table was already set. "I hope you like Italian food. I'm not an amazing cook, but pasta is hard to ruin. It smells wonderful." They sat down to eat, and James noticed that Elizabeth seemed nervous, something he rarely saw in her. She poured them each a glass of wine. "I've been thinking all week," she said finally. "About us? About whether there could be an us." James set down his fork, suddenly not hungry. And I'm still scared." Elizabeth looked directly at him. "I'm scared of what people will say. I'm scared of losing respect at the company I built. I'm scared that in 10 years you'll regret choosing someone so much older." She took a deep breath. "But most of all, I'm scared that I'll say no to something real because of fear, and that would be the biggest regret of all." James felt his heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want to try, carefully, privately, at first. I need to figure out how this fits into my life, into the company." "We can go as slow as you need," James said, reaching across the table for her hand. She let him take it, her fingers cool against his. "There's something else we need to discuss," Elizabeth said. "The company, I can't be your direct supervisor if we're involved. It wouldn't be fair to you or to the other employees." James nodded. "I understand. I could transfer to another department. Actually, I have a different idea." Elizabeth's eyes brightened with the same look she got when solving a difficult design problem. "I've been thinking about opening a second office, focusing on digital marketing. The board has been pushing for it. You could head that division." "Me? But I've only been with the company for a year. And in that time you've proven your talent and judgment. You're ready for more responsibility." She squeezed his hand. "It would be good for the company, good for your career, and it would give us some professional distance." After dinner, they moved to the sofa with their wine. The conversation shifted to lighter topics: books they loved, places they wanted to travel, music that moved them. The age gap that had seemed so important faded away as they discovered how much they had in common, how easily they understood each other. As the evening grew late, James knew he should leave. They had agreed to move slowly, to be careful, but when Elizabeth walked him to the door, they stood close, neither wanting the night to end. "Thank you for dinner," he said softly. "Thank you for being patient with me." James leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. Their first real kiss was gentle, tentative, a question being asked and answered. When they parted, Elizabeth's eyes remained closed for a moment, a small smile on her lips. "Good night, James." "Good night, Elizabeth." 6 months had passed since that first dinner at Elizabeth's apartment. Spring had turned to summer, and now the leaves were changing color, painting the city in warm oranges and reds. The new digital marketing office had opened with James as its director. His team was small but talented, and they had already landed 3 major clients. Elizabeth and James had been careful, as promised. At work, they maintained a strictly professional relationship. Few people at the company knew about their personal connection, though some had begun to suspect. They hadn't hidden completely. They'd occasionally attended industry events together and had dinner with a few trusted friends, but they had moved at Elizabeth's pace, giving her time to grow comfortable with their unusual relationship. Tonight was different. Tonight was the company's 20th anniversary party, and they had decided to attend together, not hiding their relationship for the first time in front of all their colleagues. "Are you sure about this?" James asked as their taxi approached a hotel where the event was being held. Elizabeth looked stunning in a deep blue dress, her silver hair elegantly styled. She took his hand. "I'm sure. I'm tired of pretending, and I'm proud to be with you." Her voice was steady, but he could feel a slight tremor in her fingers. The ballroom was already crowded when they arrived. Heads turned as they entered together, James's hand resting lightly at the small of Elizabeth's back. He felt her straighten her shoulders, facing the curious looks with the same confidence she brought to client presentations. Tom approached first, eyes widening slightly as he looked between them. "Elizabeth, James, good to see you both." Tom, Elizabeth smiled warmly. The party looks wonderful. Thank you for organizing it. The initial awkwardness faded as more people came to congratulate Elizabeth on the company's milestone. Some gave surprised glances when they realized James and Elizabeth were together, but most were polite, if curious. Later, as they stood near the windows overlooking the city lights, Anna, the senior art director, joined them. So, she said, looking between them with a small smile. How long has this been going on? Elizabeth exchanged a look with James. A while, she admitted. Anna nodded. I thought so. You both seemed different lately, happier. She raised her glass. Good for you. As Anna walked away, Elizabeth let out a breath. That wasn't so bad. No, James agreed. People care about you, Elizabeth. They want you to be happy. And I am, she said softly, happier than I expected to be at this stage of my life. When the music started, James led Elizabeth to the dance floor. They moved together easily, having practiced in her living room many evenings over the past months. As they danced, James noticed people watching them, some smiling, others whispering. He found he didn't care. What are you thinking? Elizabeth asked, looking up at him. I'm thinking that I love you, he said simply. It wasn't the first time he had said the words, but it was the first time he had said them so publicly. Elizabeth's eyes softened. I love you too. Later that night, they walked along the river, still dressed in their party clothes. The evening had been a success. There had been a few uncomfortable moments, a few too personal questions, but overall their colleagues had been supportive, or at least respectful. I've been thinking, Elizabeth said as they leaned against the railing, watching the moonlight on the water. About the future. James turned to look at her. They had carefully avoided discussing the future too concretely, focusing instead on enjoying their time together. What about it? He asked. I'm going to be 62 next month, she said. I've been running the company for 20 years. Maybe it's time to think about stepping back, not completely, but moving to a chairman role rather than CEO. Is that what you want? Elizabeth looked out at the water. I think it might be. The company is strong. The new digital division is thriving under your leadership. She turned to face him. And I find myself wanting more time for other things, for travel, for art, for us. James felt a surge of emotion. I want that too. There's something else, Elizabeth said, reaching into her small evening bag. She pulled out a key. I've been thinking about asking you to move in with me. My place is bigger and you're there most nights anyway. She held out the key. What do you think? James took the key, closing his hand around it. I think yes.